This is The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault, Chapter 5 of The Birth of the Clinic, The Lesson of the Hospitals, Part 5. In the article entitled Abus in the Dictionnaire de Médecine, Vic Dazier sees the organization of a system of teaching within the hospital as the universal solution for the problems of medical training. That, for him, is the major reform to be carried out. Diseases and death offered great lessons in hospitals. Are we benefiting from them? Are we writing the history of the illnesses that strike so many victims in our hospitals? Do we teach in our hospitals the art of observing and treating diseases? Have we set up any chairs of the clinical medicine in our hospitals? Yet, in a very short time, this reform of the teaching system was to assume a much wider significance. It was recognized that it could reorganize the whole of medical knowledge and establish in the knowledge of disease itself, unknown or forgotten, but more fundamental, more decisive forms of experience. The clinic and the clinic alone was capable of reviving among the moderns the temples of Apollo and Asclepius. A way of teaching and saying became a way of learning and seeing. At the end of the 18th century, as at the beginning of the Renaissance, education was given a positive value as enlightenment. To train was a way of bringing to light and therefore of discovering. The childhood and youth of things and men were endowed with an ambiguous power to tell of the birth of truth, but also to put to the test the tardy truth of men, to rectify it, to bring it closer to its nudity. The child became the immediate master of the adult insofar as true education was identified with the very genesis of truth. In every child, things tirelessly repeat their youth. The world resumes contact with its native form. He who looks for the first time is never an adult. When it has united its old kinships, the eye is able to open at the unchanging, ever-present level of things, and of all the senses and all the sources of knowledge, tous les savoirs. It is intelligent enough to be the most unintelligent by repeating so skillfully its distant ignorance. The ear has its preferences. the hand its lines and its folds, the eye, which is akin to light, supports only the present. What allows man to resume contact with childhood and to rediscover the permanent birth of truth is this bright, distant, open naivete of the gaze. Hence, the two great mythical experiences on which the philosophy of the 18th century had wished to base its beginning. The foreign spectator in an unknown country, and the man born blind restored to light. But Pestalozzi and the Bildungsroman also belong to the great theme of childhood gaze. The discourse of the world passes through open eyes. Eyes open at every instant for the first time. With the reaction that set in after 9 Thermidor, the pessimism of Cabanis and Canton seemed to be confirmed. The expected brigandage became widespread. From the beginning of the war, but especially after the mass rising of autumn 1793, many doctors joined the army, either as volunteers or conscripts. The quacks had a free field. A petition addressed on 26 Brumaire, year number 2, to the convention, and drawn up by a certain Caron of the Poissonniere section, was still denouncing doctors trained by the faculty as vulgar charlatans, against whom the people wished to be defended. But this fear soon took on a different shape, and the danger was seen to come from the real charlatans who were not doctors. The public has been subjected to a host of ill-taught individuals who, on no other authority but their own, have set themselves up as masters of the art, who hand out remedies quite indiscriminately and threaten the lives of several thousand citizens. The disasters caused by this savage medicine were so great in one department that the Directoire, alerted to the danger, called the Assemblée des 500, and on 2 occasions, the 13 Messidor year 4 and the 24 Niveau year 6. The government requested the legislature to limit this dangerous liberty. O representative citizens, the nation is making its maternal cries heard, and the executive directory is their organ. This is certainly a matter of the utmost urgency. The delay of a single day may mean the death of several citizens. Inadequately trained doctors and experienced quacks were equally dangerous, especially when the hospitalization of the poor and sick became increasingly difficult. The nationalization of hospital funds sometimes went so far as the confiscation of liquid capital, and many bursars had no other course but to turn out boarders whom they could no longer keep. Sick or wounded soldiers occupied many of the establishments, and the municipalities were delighted that they no longer had to find the resources for their hospitals. At Poitiers, on 15 July 1793, 200 patients were turned out of the Hotel Dieu to make room for wounded soldiers whose board was paid for by the army. This dehospitalization of illness, brought about by a spontaneous convergence of hard facts and revolutionary dreams, far from restoring pathological essences to a truth of nature and reducing them by that very fact, merely added to the ravages that they were already causing and left the population without either protection or help. No doubt many medical officers came and settled down as civilian practitioners in town and country on leaving the army at the end of the Thermidorian period and the beginning of the Directoire, but the quality of these doctors was not uniform. Many medical officers were very lacking in training and experience. In year 2, the Comité du Salut Public had asked the Comité d'Instruction Publique to draft a bill whereby officers of health can be trained without delay for the needs of the armies of the Republic. But the situation had been too urgent. All volunteers had been accepted and given a rapid training, and apart from the first grade officers of health who had to show proof of previous training, they had no further knowledge of medicine than what they had just been taught. Even in the army, these ill-trained practitioners had been criticized for their numerous mistakes. But when they practiced among the civilian population, without the supervision of their seniors, such doctors caused far worse damage. There was the case of an officer of health in the Creuse who killed his patients by administering purges of arsenic. From all sides, demands flowed in for proper control and supervision, and for new legislation. With how many ignorant murderers will you inundate France if you authorize second and third class physicians, surgeons, and chemists to practice their respective professions without a new examination? It is, above all, that in that homicidal society that one still finds The most respected, most dangerous charlatans, those whom the law must take its task to supervise. Protective bodies sprang up spontaneously against this state of affairs. Some of the more precariously based were popular in origin. In certain of the more moderate Parisian sections remained faithful to the axiom of the mountain. No more indigents, no more hospitals, and continued to demand the distribution of individual aid to benefit the sick who were cared for at home, and others, including the poorest, were forced by penury and the difficulty of obtaining treatment to demand the setting up of hospitals in which the poor and sick would be lodged, fed, and treated. They hoped for a return to the principle of the poorhouse, and houses were opened, clearly without governmental initiative, with funds raised by popular societies and assemblies. After Thermidor, on the other hand, the movement came from above. The enlightened classes, the intellectual circles, who had returned to power or obtained it at last, wished to restore to knowledge the privileges that would be able to protect both the social order and individual lives. In several cities, the administrations, affrighted by the ills that they had witnessed and afflicted by the silence of the law, did not wait until the legislature had made its decisions. They decided to establish their own control over those who claimed to practice medicine. They set up commissions composed of doctors of the ancient regime who would pass judgment on the qualifications, knowledge, and experience of all newcomers. Furthermore, certain faculties that had been closed down continued to function in semi-secrecy. The former professors gathered around themselves those who wished to learn, and were accompanied by these students on their visits. If they were placed in charge of a hospital department, it was there at their patient's bedside that they gave their teaching and were able to judge the aptitude of their pupils. Sometimes, when these purely private studies were completed, the professors even issued a sort of unofficial diploma, certifying that the holder had become a true doctor. Montpellier provided what was, no doubt, a fairly rare example of a meeting place for these various forms of reaction. One can see the appearance there of the need to train doctors for the army, the use of the old medical qualifications sanctioned by the ancient regime, the intervention of popular assemblies and of the local administration, and the spontaneous beginnings of clinical experience. Baumes a former university professor, had been appointed, both for his experience and his Republican opinions, to the military hospital at Saint Éloi. There, he was to make a selection from among the candidates for the posts of officers of health. But since no teaching had been organized, the medical students appealed to the Society of the People, which, by means of a petition, persuaded the district administration to establish clinical teaching at the Hospital of Saint Éloi. Under Boehm's supervision, in the following year, 1794, Boehm's published the results of his observations and teaching. Method for curing diseases as they appear in the course of the medical year. This may be a privileged example, but it is no less significant for that, by a spontaneous convergence of pressures and demands proceeding from social classes, institutional structures, technological or scientific problems of every kind, and an experience was beginning to be formed by a kind of orthogenesis. To all appearances, it was simply reviving as the only possible way of salvation the clinical tradition that had been developed in the 18th century. In fact, what was involved was something quite different, in that autonomous movement and the quasi-clandestinity that abetted and protected it. This return to the clinic was in fact the first organization of a medical field that was at once composite and fundamental. Composite because, in its everyday practice, hospital experience resembles the general form of a pedagogic system, but fundamental too because, unlike the 18th century clinic, it is not a question of an encounter after the event, of a previously formed experience and an ignorance to be dissipated. It is a question, in the absence of any previous structure, of a domain in which truth teaches itself and, in exactly the same way, offers itself to the gaze of both the experienced observer and the naive apprentice. For both, there is only one language, the hospital, in which the series of patients examined is itself a school. The abolition of both the old hospital structures and the university made possible, then, the immediate communication of teaching within the concrete field of experience. Furthermore, it effaced dogmatic language as an essential stage in the transmission of truth. The silencing of university speech, la parole universitaire, and the abolition of the professorial chair made it possible. Beneath the old language, in the obscurity of a partly blind practice, driven this way and that by circumstances, for a language without words, possessing an entirely new syntax to be formed, a language that did not owe its truth to speech, but to the gaze alone. In this hasty recourse to the clinic, another clinic with an entirely new configuration was born. It is hardly surprising if suddenly, at the end of the convention, the theme of an entirely new medicine based upon the clinic swept away the theme of a medicine restored to liberty that had been dominant right up to 1793. What occurred was neither reaction, although the social consequences were, in general, reactionary, nor progress, although medicine as a practice and as a science benefited in several ways. What occurred was the restructuring in a precise historical context of the theme of medicine in liberty, in a liberated domain, the necessity of the truth that communicated itself to the gaze was to define its own institutional and scientific structures. It was not only out of political opportunism, but no doubt also out of an obscure fidelity to coherences that no twisting in events could deflect. That in year Roman numeral II, the same Foucault opposed any project aimed at restoring the Gothic universities and aristocratic academies, and in year Roman numeral III demanded that the temporary closure of the faculties should be used to bring about their reform and improvement. Murderous quackery and ambitious ignorance must not be allowed to lay their traps for credulous suffering. What hitherto had been lacking, the very practice of the art, the observation of patients in their beds, was to become the essential part of the new medicine. Thermidor and the Directoire took the clinic as their major theme in the institutional reorganization of medicine. For them, it was a means of putting an end to the dangerous experiment of total liberty, and yet a way of giving it a positive meaning, a way, too, of restoring, as many wished, some of the structures of the ancient regime. Okay, Roman numeral I, the measures of 14 Frimaire, year Roman numeral III. Fourcroy had been given the task of presenting a report to the convention on the establishment of an École de Same in Paris. The justifications that he offered are worth noting, especially in view of the fact that they were taken up virtually in toto in the preamble of the law that was in fact passed. Though he departs more than once from the letter and the spirit of the project. What was proposed was the establishment, above all, of a single school for the whole of France, modeled on the École Centrale des Travaux Publics, where officers of health would be trained to staff hospitals, especially the military hospitals. Had not 600 doctors been killed in the army in under 18 months. Apart from the urgency of the situation and the need to put an end to the malpractices of charlatans, there was a need to remove a number of important objections that might be raised against a measure that ran the risk of restoring the old corporations and their privileges. Medicine is a practical science whose truth and success are of interest to the whole nation. By setting up a school, one is not favoring a small handful of individuals, but through qualified intermediaries, one is helping the people to feel the benefits of truth. As the writer of the report rather awkwardly puts it, it is to give fresh life to the several channels that circulate the industrious activity of the arts and sciences through all the ramifications of the social body. What makes medicine thus understood a corpus of knowledge of use to all citizens is its immediate relationship with nature. Instead of being, like the old faculty, the locus of an esoteric, bookish corpus of knowledge, the new school would be the temple of nature. There one would learn not what the old masters thought they knew, but that form of truth open to all that is manifested in everyday practice. Practice will be linked to theoretical precepts. Pupils will be practiced in chemical experiments, anatomical dissections, surgical operations, and in the use of machinery. Read little, see much, and do much. They will learn as they practice, at the patient's bedside, instead of useless physiologies. They will learn the true art of curing. The clinical figures, then, as a structure that is essential to the scientific coherence and also to the social utility and political purity of the new medical organization. It represents the truth of that organization in guaranteed liberty. Foucault proposed that in 3 hospitals, the Hospice de l'Humanité, the Hospice de l'Unité, and the Hôpital de l'École, the clinical teaching should be entrusted to professors who would be sufficiently well paid to be able to devote themselves to the task entirely. The public would be freely admitted to the new school of health. In this way, it was hoped that all those who practiced medicine without proper training would come out of their own free will to complete their experience. In any case, in each district, pupils would be chosen who had shown good conduct, pure morals, love of the Republic, and a hatred of tyrants, sufficient education, and above all, a knowledge of some of the sciences that might serve as a preliminary to the art of curing. And they would be sent to the École Centrale de Médecins to be trained over a period of 3 years as officers of health. For the provinces, Fourcroy proposed that there should be only special schools. The deputies from the south of France objected and insisted that Montpellier should also have its École Centrale. Then Herman demanded the same privilege for Strasbourg, with the result that the law of 14 Frimaire, year Roman numeral 3, provided for the setting up of 3 schools of medicine, each providing a course of teaching lasting 3 years. In Paris, the beginners class would study anatomy, physiology, and medical chemistry during the first semester, and materia medica, botany, and physics during the second. Throughout the year, the students would visit hospitals in order to get used to seeing the sick and how they are treated. Second year students would study first anatomy, physiology, chemistry, pharmacy, and surgery, then materia medica, internal and external pathology. During this second year, students might be employed in the hospitals in the service of the sick. In the final year, the students would revise what they had learned in the first 2 years and, benefiting from the hospital experience already gained, begin their real clinical training. The students would be distributed among the 3 hospitals, in each of which they would remain 4 months, then move on. The clinical training consisted of 2 parts. The professor would pause at the bedside of each patient long enough to question him and examine him properly. He would draw the students' attention to the diagnostic signs and the important symptoms of the disease. Then, in the lecture hall, the professor would take up the general history of the illnesses observed in the hospital ward, and he would point out their known, probable, and hidden causes, make a prognosis, and provide vital, curative, or palliative indications. What characterized this reform was not only that the balance of medicine was shifted further in the direction of the clinic, but that this was also counterbalanced by much broader theoretical teaching. Once one defined a practical experiment carried out on the patient himself, one insisted on the need to relate particular knowledge to an encyclopedic whole. The first two principles by which the New Paris School commented on the law of 14 Frimaire required that it know animal economy from the elementary structure of the inanimate body to the most composite phenomena of the organism and life, and that it strive to show the relationships that exist between living bodies and those in nature. Furthermore, this broadening of interest would bring medicine into contact with a whole series of problems and practical requirements by revealing the inseparableness of the human being with the material conditions of existence. It would show how one can preserve an individual life as free from ills as much and as for as long as men can reasonably expect. And it would represent the point of contact between the art of healing and the civil order. Clinical medicine is not, therefore, a medicine concerned only with the first degree of empiricism, seeking to reduce by some kind of methodical skepticism all its knowledge and teaching to observation of the visible alone. At this first stage, medicine is not defined as clinical unless it is also defined as encyclopedic knowledge of nature and knowledge of man in society. Roman numeral 2, Reforms and Controversies in Years 5 and Roman numeral 6. The measures passed on 14 Frimaire fell far short of solving all the problems that presented themselves. By opening the École de Santé to the public, it was hoped that inadequately trained officers of health would be attracted, and that by free competition quacks and amateurs would disappear. Nothing of the kind occurred. The inadequate number of schools, the absence of examinations, except for students with scholarships, prevented the formation of a body of qualified doctors. On 4 occasions, 13 Messidor year Roman numeral 4, 22 Brumaire and 4 Frimaire year Roman numeral 5, and 24 Niveau year Roman numeral 6. The Directoire had to remind the assemblies of the damage caused by the free practice of medicine, the bad training of practitioners, and the lack of effective legislation. What was needed then was to find a system for controlling doctors who had set up in practice since the Revolution, and to extend the recruitment, the rigor, and the influence of the new schools. Moreover, the teaching provided by the schools themselves was open to criticism. The program was far too broad and too ambitious for a course that lasted only 3 years, as it did under the ancient regime. By demanding too much, one achieves nothing. There was little unity between the various courses. At the École de Paris, for example, a clinical medicine of symptoms was taught, while at the same time, in internal pathology, Deblay was teaching the most traditional kind of medicine of species. First, the most general causes, then the general phenomena, the nature and character of each class of diseases, and of its principal divisions. He repeated the same examination on the genera and species, but the clinic itself did not provide the training that had been expected of it. There were too many students and too many patients. One moves rapidly round the ward. One says a few words about the outcome of this or that development, and then one hastily withdraws. And that is what passes for teaching in a clinic. In the larger hospitals, one usually sees a great many patients, but very few diseases. Finally, taking full advantage of all these criticisms, the former members of the medical societies were successful in demanding the restoration of a medical profession defined by qualifications and protected by laws. The medical societies, which had disappeared together with the university in August 1792, were reconstituted shortly after the passing of the law of 14 Frimaire. The first of these was the Société de Santé, founded on 2 Germinal year Roman numeral 4, with Desgenet, Lafisse, Bertrand Ploterier, and Levielle. In principle, it was intended to serve as a free, neutral organ of information, rapid communication of observations and experiments, knowledge available to all those concerned with the art of healing. In short, a sort of great clinic on a national scale, which would do no more than observe and practice. The Society's first prospectus declared, "Medicine rests on precepts for which experience alone can provide the basis. In order to collect them, We need the cooperation of observers. For this reason, several branches of medicine have declined since the destruction of the learned societies. But from now on, they will grow and flourish once again under the auspices of a constituted government that cannot but view with satisfaction the formation of free societies of observer practitioners. It was in this spirit that the society, convinced that the isolation of persons is entirely prejudicial to the interests of mankind, published a recueil périodique, which was soon supplanted by another devoted to foreign medical literature. But before long, this universal concern for information revealed what was no doubt its true preoccupation: to regroup those doctors whose competence had been validated by ordinary studies, and to militate in favor of a new definition of the limits of the free practice of medicine. Let me not be permitted to conceal from history the memory of those disastrous times when an impious and barbarous hand smashed in France the altars devoted to the cult of medicine. They have disappeared, those bodies whose ancient fame attested to their long-standing successes. With this selective rather than informative character, the movement spread to the provinces. Societies were founded at Lyon, Brussels, Nancy, Bordeaux, and Grenoble. On 5 Messidor of the same year, another society held its inaugural meeting in Paris with Alibert, Bichat, Bretonneau, Cabanis, Desgenet, Dupuytren, Fourcroy, Leray, and Pinel. To a far greater degree than the Société de Same, it represented the opinions of the new medicine. The temple gates must be shut against those who have entered without deserving to, taking advantage of the fact that at the first signal of the revolution, the sanctuary of medicine, like the temple of Janus, was flung wide open to admit the onrushing crowd. But the method of teaching practiced in the schools set up in year Roman numeral 3 must also be reformed. A hasty composite training that provides the doctor with no reliable method of observation and diagnosis, so the philosophical reasoned march of method must replace the irregular tottering walk of the unmethodical activity. In the eyes of public opinion, outside the directoire and the assemblies, but not without their at least tacit assent, and with the constant support of the representatives of the enlightened bourgeoisie and the ideologues close to the government, the clinical idea assumed a rather different meaning from that introduced by the legislators of the year Roman numeral III. Article 356 of the Directoire Constitution declared that the law supervises those professions concerned with the health of citizens. It was on the strength of this article, which seemed to promise control, limitations, and guarantees, that all the polemics were conducted. This is not the place to give a detailed account of these polemics, but the controversy was centered mainly around the question as to whether one should first reorganize the system of teaching, then draw up the conditions for the practice of medicine, or, on the contrary, first purge the medical body, define the norms of practice, and only then decide what form medical studies should take. Between these two theses, the political division was clear-cut. Those least removed from conventional tradition, such as Donneau or Prieur de la Côte d'Or, wanted to reintegrate the officers of health and all the amateur practitioners of medicine by providing a very open system of teaching. The others around Cabanes and Pastoret wanted to hasten the reconstitution of an enclosed medical body. At the beginning of the Directoire, it was the first group that had most support. The first plan of reform had been drawn up by Donneau, one of the authors of the Constitution of the year number 3, Roman numeral 3, who in the convention had Girondist sympathies. He did not wish to alter substantially the Frimaire laws, but he wanted to see, in addition to the establishment of complementary courses in medicine in 23 provincial hospitals, their doctors would be able to improve their knowledge, and it would then be possible for local authorities to require proper qualifications for the practice of medicine. You will not reestablish guild masterships, but you will require proof of capacity. One may become a doctor without having attended a school, but you will demand a solemn guarantee of the knowledge of every candidate. In this way, you will reconcile the rights of individual liberty with those of public safety. There, even more clearly than before, the clinic appears as the concrete solution to the problem of the training of doctors and of the definition of medical experience. Actually, the definition of medical competence. Because of its timidity in reform and because of its fidelity to the principles of year Roman numeral III, Donou's project was unanimously criticized. Barillon called it a prescription for organized murder. A few weeks later, the Commission d'Instruction Publique presented another report, drawn up this time by Michel. This second report was written in a quite different spirit. In order to win acceptance for a reconstitution of a professional body of doctors, which was implicit in his project, he opposed the distinction whereby physicians were confined to the towns, surgeons being all that was needed in the country, and apothecaries being entrusted with the treatment of children. In the 5 schools to be set up in Paris, Montpellier, Nancy, Brussels, and Angers, physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries must attend the same courses. Studies would be checked by 6 examinations, which the students would take when they thought fit. A surgeon would need to take only 3. Lastly, a jury composed of doctors and pharmacists would be set up in each department that would be consulted on all matters relating to the art of healing and to public health. Under the pretext of a more rational system of teaching, to be provided by a greater number of faculties for all those concerned with public health, Michel's project aimed principally to re-establish a body of doctors qualified by a system of standardized studies and examination. Michel's project, supported by doctors like Barillon and Vité, was in turn violently attacked from the outside by the École de Montpellier, which declared that it was satisfied with the measures taken by the convention, and within the assembly itself by all those who remained faithful to the spirit of year Roman numeral III. Things dragged on, taking advantage of the thwarting of the counter-revolution by the 18 Fructidor. Prieur de la Côte d'Or, a former member of the Comité de Salut Public, succeeded in having Michel's project sent to the Commission d'Instruction Publique. He criticized it for the insignificant place it accorded to the clinic and for its advocacy of a return to the teaching of the old faculties. For it is not enough that the student should listen and read. He must also see touch, and above all, practice, and acquire the habit of practice. In this way, Prieur obtained a double tactical advantage. He showed the validity at the scientific level of the experience acquired by those who had more or less taught themselves medicine since 1792, and stressing how expensive such clinical teaching was, he suggested that instead of increasing the number of schools, and thus sacrificing quality to quantity, only the school in Paris should be maintained. This amounted quite simply to a return to Fourcroy's project in its original form. But meanwhile, on the very day before the uprising that was to reveal him as one of the leaders of the royalist plot and so force him into exile, Pastorette had got a law passed through the Cinq-Cents concerned with the practice of medicine. A jury was to be set up for each of the 3 écoles de santé, composed of 2 physicians, 2 surgeons, and a pharmacist, whose task would be to supervise all those who wished to practice on their own. Moreover, all those who are now practicing the art of healing without having been legally received according to the forms laid down by the ancient laws will be obliged to present themselves within 3 months. All those who had taken up medicine during the previous 5 years were, therefore, subjected to examination by juries trained in the old school. Doctors would once again be able to control their own recruitment. They would be reconstituted as a body capable of defining their own criteria of competence. The principle had gained acceptance, but the small number of écoles de santé made its application difficult. By demanding that they be reduced still further, Prieur thought that he would make the application of Pastorette's law impossible. In any case, this law remained a dead letter, and hardly 4 months had elapsed since it had been passed when the Directoire was compelled once again to draw the legislators' attention to the dangers that an uncontrolled medicine presented for citizens. A positive law should compel anyone who claims to practice one of the professions of the art of healing to undergo long studies and examination by a severe jury. Science and custom must be respected, but incompetence and imprudence must be contained. Public penalties should deter cupidity and suppress crimes that are little short of murder. On 17 Vento year Roman numeral 6, Vitet revived before the Cinq-Cents the main lines of Caylus' projects. 5 schools of medicine, in each department a council of health that would be concerned with epidemics and means of preserving the health of the inhabitants and which would take part in the election of the professors, a series of 4 examinations to be held on fixed dates. The only real innovation was the requirement of a clinical test. The candidate doctor will expound at the patient's bedside the character of the species of disease and its treatment. Thus, for the first time, the criteria of theoretical knowledge and those of a practice that can be linked only to experience and custom were found together in a single institutional framework. Vitet's project did not permit the integration or gradual assimilation into official medicine of the free medicine that had been practiced since 1792. But it recognized theoretically and in the framework of normal studies the value of practice acquired in the hospitals. It was not free medicine that was being recognized, but the value of experience as such in medicine. Callus' plan had seemed too rigorous in the year Roman numeral 5. Vitet's plan, supported in turn by Callus and Barillon, aroused as much opposition. It seemed quite clear that no reform of medical teaching would be possible until the problem for which it acted as a screen had been solved. Namely, the problem of the practice of medicine. Callus' project having been rejected, Barillon proposed to the 500 a resolution expressing in clear terms what had been its implicit meaning. No one could practice the art of healing unless he possessed qualifications deriving from either the new schools or the old faculties. Porcher defended the same thesis in the Conseil d'Anchamp. The whole problem was caught up in a political and conceptual impasse. But at least all these discussions had had the merit of revealing what the real question was. Not the number or the program of the École de Seine, but the very meaning of the medical profession and the privileged character of the experience that it defines. Roman numeral 3, Cabanis intervention and the reorganization of year Roman numeral 6. Chronologically speaking, Cabanis presented his reports on medical administration between Barillon project and the discussion of Vendémiaire in the Anchamp on 4 Messidor year Roman numeral 6. In fact, this text already belonged to another age. It marked the stage at which ideology was to take an active and often determining part in political and social restructuring. In this respect, Cabanis' text on medical administration is closer in spirit to the reforms of the Consulate than to the polemics contemporary with it. Although it attempted to define the conditions for a practical solution, it sought above all to provide the outline of a theory of the medical profession. At the immediate practical level, Cabanis dealt with two problems, that of the officers of health and that of examinations. The senior officers presented no difficulties. They could be allowed to practice without further formalities. The others, however, would have to undergo an examination specially intended for them. It would be confined to the fundamental skills of the art, particularly those relating to its practice. Ordinary medical studies, however, would have to be controlled by an examination, including a written test, an oral test, and exercises in anatomy, surgery, and internal and external clinical medicine. Once the criteria of competence had been laid down, a selection could be made of those to whom the lives of citizens might be safely entrusted. Medicine would then become a closed profession. Any person practicing medicine who has not passed the examinations of the schools or who has not appeared before the special juries will be fined, or, if the offense is repeated, committed to prison. The essential part of the text concerns the nature of the medical profession. The problem was to assign to it a closed domain, reserved to it alone, without either resorting to the corporative structures of the ancient regime or returning to forms of state control that might be reminiscent of the convention period. Taking industry in the wide sense of the term, Cabanis distinguishes between two categories of objects. There are objects whose nature is such that the consumers are themselves the judges of their utility. That is, public consciousness is sufficient to determine their value. This value is placed upon it by public opinion, is external to the object itself. It can have no secrets, no error, no mystification, since it resides in a consensus. The idea of determining a value by decree had no more meaning than wishing to impose a truth upon it from the outside. Real value can only be a free value. In a well-regulated social state, the freedom of industry must meet with no obstacle. It must complete, unlimited, and as the development of an industry can become useful to him who cultivates it only insofar as it is useful to the public, it follows that the general interest is here truly at one with the particular interest. But there are also industries whose object and value do not depend upon a collective decision. Either these objects are among those that serve to determine the market value of other objects, precious metals, for example, or they relate to the human individual, about whom any error may prove fatal. Thus, the value of an industrial object cannot be determined by consensus when it is itself a market criterion, or when it concerns by its very existence a member of the consensus. In either case, the industrial object has an intrinsic value that is not immediately visible. It is therefore subject to error and fraud. It must therefore be gauged. But how can the competent public be given an instrument of measurement that would itself involve competence? The public must delegate to the state control not over each of the objects produced, which would be contrary to the principles of economic freedom, but over the producer himself. The state must verify his capacity, his moral value, and, from time to time, the real value and quality of the objects that he produces. There's distilled water, lime juice, and a dropper full of this stuff. Is the only thing I drink at this time. Therefore, doctors should be supervised in the same way that goldsmiths are supervised. As men of secondary industry who do not produce wealth, but who treat that which measures or produces wealth. That is why physicians, surgeons, and pharmacists must be subject to stringent examination as to their knowledge, their abilities, and their moral habits. This does not mean that industry will be impeded or the liberty of the individual infringed. Cabanis' proposition was not accepted. Yet, in broad outline, it indicated the solution that was to be adopted, giving medicine the status of a liberal and protected profession that it has preserved up to the 20th century. The law of 19 Ventos year Roman numeral 11 concerning the practice of medicine conforms with Cabanis' themes and, in a more general way, with those of the ideologues. It provided for a two-tier hierarchy in the medical body. Doctors in medicine and surgery who had qualified in one of the 6 schools and the officers of health, who would institutionalize in definitive form those whom cannabis had wished to reintegrate on a provisional footing. After 4 examinations, anatomy and physiology, pathology and nosography, materia medica, hygiene and forensic medicine, doctors would take a test in clinical medicine, internal and external, according to whether they wished to become physicians or surgeons. The officers of health, who would provide the most ordinary care, would study for only 3 years in schools, though even this would not be indispensable if they could prove that they had practiced for 5 years in civil or military hospitals, or for 6 years as a doctor, private pupil, or assistant. They would be examined by a department jury. Anyone not belonging to either of these 2 categories who dabbled in medicine would incur penalties ranging from a fine to imprisonment. This whole movement of ideas, projects, and measures between the year Roman numeral 6 and the year Roman numeral 11 had certain decisive significations. Number 1, in defining the closed character of the medical profession, one managed to avoid both the old corporative model and that control over medical acts themselves, which was so repugnant to economic liberalism. The principle of choice and its control were based on the notion of competence, that is, on a set of possibilities that characterized the very person of the doctor. Knowledge, experience, and that recognized probity referred to by Cabanis. The medical act is worth what he who has performed it is worth. His intrinsic value is a function of the socially recognized quality of the producer. Thus, within an economic liberalism patently inspired by Adam Smith, is defined a profession that is both liberal and closed. Number 2, in this world of aptitudes, however, a difference of level was introduced. On the one hand, there were the doctors, and on the other, the officers of health. The old difference between physicians and surgeons, between the internal and external, what one knows and what one sees, is made secondary by this new distinction. It is no longer a question of a difference in the object or in the way in which the object is manifested, but of a difference of level in the experience of the knowing subject. Between physicians and surgeons, there was already no doubt a hierarchy that was reflected in institutions, but it derived from an earlier difference in the objective domain of their activity. It was now displaced towards the qualitative index of this activity. Number 3, this distinction had an objective correlation. The officers of health would treat the industrious and active people. In the 18th century, it was accepted that the laboring classes, especially those in the country, led a more simple, moral, and healthy life than others, and were subject primarily to the external illnesses that came within the competence of the surgeon. From the year Roman numeral 11, the distinction became a social one. One did not have to be learned and profound in theory in order to treat the people, who often suffered from primitive accidents and simple indispositions. The officer of health would be quite experienced enough to deal with such matters. The history of the art, as that of men, shows that the nature of things, like the order of civilized societies,
absolutely requires this distinction. In conformity with the ideal order of economic liberalism, the period of qualities corresponded with the superposition of social strata. Number 4. On what was the distinction based among those practicing the art of healing? The most important part of the training of an officer of health was his years of practice, which might be as many as 6. The doctor, on the other hand, complemented his theoretical training with clinical experience. It was no doubt this difference between the practical and the clinical that was most innovatory factor in the legislation of the year Roman numeral 11. The practice required of the officer of health was a controlled empiricism, a question of knowing what to do after seeing. Experience was integrated at the level of perception, memory, and repetition. That is, at the level of the example. In the clinic, it was a question of a much more subtle and complex structure in which the integration of experience occurred in a gaze that was at the same time knowledge, a gaze that exists, that was master of its truth and free of all example, even if at times it had made use of them. Practice would be opened up to the officers of health, but the doctors would reserve the initiation into the clinic to themselves. This new definition of the clinic was bound up with a reorganization of the hospitals. At first, both Thermidor and the Directoire reverted to the liberal principles of the legislature. On 11 Thermidor year Roman numeral 3, Delacroix attacked the law providing for the nationalization of the hospital funds on the ground that it placed the burden of medical care on the state alone, instead of placing it under the protection of general commiseration and under the guardianship of the rich. Between Pluviosa and Germinal year Roman numeral 4, the government sent out to local administrations a series of circulars which, broadly speaking, reverted to the moral and economic criticisms that had been leveled. At the outset of the revolution, and even before, at the whole principle of hospitalization, the increased cost of an illness treated in a hospital, the lazy habits it induces, the financial distress and moral penury of a family deprived of a father or mother. It was hoped that there would be an increase in home treatment. However, the time was past when such treatment was regarded as universally valid, and when people dreamt of a society without almshouses and hospitals. Poverty was too widespread. There were over 60,000 paupers in Paris in the year Roman numeral 2, and their number was increasing. Popular movements were too feared, and too much suspicion surrounded the political use to which individual assistance might be put, to allow the whole system of assistance to be left to them. A structure had to be found for the preservation of both the hospitals and the privileges of medicine that was compatible with the principles of liberalism and the need for social protection. The latter understood somewhat ambiguously as the protection of the poor by the rich and the protection of the rich against the poor. One of the last acts of the Thermidorian Convention was to suspend, on 2 Brumaire year Roman numeral 4, the execution of the law to nationalize hospital funds. On the basis of a new report submitted by Delacroix on 12 Vendémiaire year Roman numeral 4, the law of 23 Messidor was definitively revoked. The funds that had been sold would be replaced by national funds, and the government would thereby be discharged of all obligation. The hospitals would recover their civil character. Their organization and management were entrusted to the municipal administrations, which would appoint a 5-member executive committee. This municipalization of the hospitals freed the state from any necessity of providing assistance and left the burden of identifying themselves with the poor to fairly small-scale collectivities. Each commune became responsible for its own poverty and for the way in which it protected itself from it. The system of obligation and compensation between rich and poor no longer passed through the law of the state, but by means of a sort of contract subject to variation in space and suspension in time. It belonged more to the order of free consent. A stranger, more hidden contract of the same kind was silently being formed about the same time between the hospital, where the poor were treated, and the clinic, in which doctors were trained. Once again, the thinking of those last days of the Revolution revived, sometimes word for word, what had been formulated in the period immediately preceding it. The most important moral problem raised by the idea of the clinic was the following. By what right can one transform into an object of clinical observation a patient whose poverty has compelled him to seek assistance at the hospital? He had asked for help of which he was the absolute subject, insofar as it had been conceived specifically for him. He was now required to be the object of a gaze, indeed a relative object, since what was being deciphered in him was seen as contributing to a better knowledge of others. Furthermore, while observing, the clinic was also carrying out research, and this search for the new exposed it to a certain amount of risk. A doctor in private practice, Aiken remarked, must take care of his reputation. His way must be that of safety, if not of certainty. In the hospital, he is not fettered in this way, and his genius may express in a new way. Does not the very essence of hospital aid become altered by the following principle? Hospital patients are, for several reasons, the most suitable subjects for an experimental course. A certain balance must be kept, of course, between the interests of knowledge and those of the patient. There must be no infringement of the natural rights of the sick or of the rights that society owes to the poor. The domain of the hospital was an ambiguous one, theoretically free, and because of the non-contractual character of the relation between doctor and patient, open to the indifference of experiment. It bristled with obligations and moral limitations, deriving from the unspoken but present contract binding man in general to poverty in its universal form. If in the hospital the doctor does not carry out theoretical experiments free of all obligation to their human object, it is because As soon as he sets foot in the hospital, he undergoes a decisive moral experience that circumscribes his otherwise unlimited practice by a closed system of duty. It is by entering the asylums where poverty and sickness languish together that he will feel those painful emotions, that active commiseration, that burning desire to bring comfort and consolation, that intimate pleasure that springs from success, and which the sight of spreading happiness cannot but increase. It is there that he will learn to be religious, humane, compassionate. But to look in order to know, to show in order to teach, is not this a tacit form of violence, all the more abusive for its silence upon a sick body that demands to be comforted, not displayed? Can pain be a spectacle? Not only can it be, but it must be, by virtue of a subtle right that resides in the fact that no one is alone. The poor man less so than others, since he can obtain assistance only through the mediation of the rich. Since disease can be cured only if others intervene with their knowledge, their resources, their pity. Since a patient can be cured only in a society, it is just that the illnesses of some should be transformed into the experience of others, and that pain should be enabled to manifest itself. The sick man does not cease to be a citizen. The history of the illnesses to which he is reduced is necessary to his fellow men because it teaches them by what ills they are threatened. If he refused to offer himself as an object of instruction, the patient would be guilty of ingratitude because he would have enjoyed the advantages resulting from sociability without paying the tribute of gratitude. And in accordance with a structure of reciprocity, there emerges for the rich man the utility of offering help to the hospitalized poor by paying for them to be treated. He is, by the same token, making possible a greater knowledge of the illnesses with which he himself may be affected. What is benevolence towards the poor is transformed into knowledge that is applicable to the rich. Beneficent gifts will assuage the ills of the poor, from which enlightenment will result for the preservation of the rich. Yes, rich benefactors, generous men, this sick man living in the bed that you have subscribed is now experiencing the disease that will be attacking you ere long. He will be cured or perish, but in either event, his fate may enlighten your physician and save your life. These, then, were the terms of the contract by which rich and poor participated in the organization of clinical experience. In a regime of economic freedom, the hospital had found a way of interesting the rich. The clinic constitutes the progressive reversal of the other contractual part. It is the interest paid by the poor on the capital that the rich have consented to invest in the hospital, an interest that must be understood in its heavy surcharge, since it is a compensation that is of the order of objective interest for science and of vital interest for the rich. The hospital became viable for private initiative from the moment that sickness, which had come to seek a cure, was turned into a spectacle. Helping ended up by paying, thanks to the virtues of the clinical gaze. These themes, which were so characteristic of pre-revolutionary thinking, and which found frequent expression before the revolution, were given new meaning and immediate application in the liberalism of the Directoire. Thus, this morally disarmed and socially so dangerous class may be of the greatest possible use to honorable families. Morality will find its reward in that which flouts it, for the women not being in a state to exercise beneficence, at least contribute to the training of good doctors and repay their benefactors with interest. The doctor's gaze is a very small saving in the calculated exchanges of a liberal world. That's the end of chapter 5 of The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault.